Hey guys, it's Ellen Brock, freelance editor. This is part 3 of my Q&A. I hope that you guys are ready to listen to me talk about some writing questions that you have, and I'm just going to go through very casually and answer your questions, so I hope that you enjoy it. And if you want to make this a regular section on the channel, just let me know because I'm really curious if you guys like these Q&A videos. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Blake asks, what are the limits of middle grade in terms of violence and overall adult topics? This has a lot more to do with approach than it has to do with specifically what you can and cannot do. In general, middle grade violence tends to focus more on creatures and monsters and non-real entities because it's less disturbing for children. So to see a monster of some kind being murdered isn't as upsetting to parents, to teachers, to librarians, and to the kids themselves. So that's usually where the violence is aimed, but of course that is not by any means a hard and fast rule. In terms of other adult topics, I would say know your audience and understand what middle grade kids are aware of and what interests them. Certain types of adult conflicts or topics or things that might be considered edgier won't necessarily have any meaning to a middle grade kid, so you might want to avoid it just for that reason. But if it is something that concerns kids, taking an approach to it that makes it feel not quite as scary would be the best thing that you could do. Not making it overly intense, but there's not really a hard and fast rule. I actually went through a bunch of middle grade, I think it was in 2014. I went through a bunch of middle grade novels and I sort of tried to study like the violence, and it varies a lot, but it really has to do with the tone of the violence and how you convey it. So just try to keep that in mind. But if your story calls for some kind of adult content, I wouldn't worry about it too much unless it's to a degree that you would not let a 8, 9, 10-year-old kid read it. If you're writing upper middle grade, I would still say keep it appropriate for 10, 11, because you just don't want to have something in there that is going to upset parents because they're the gatekeepers. These kids are not going to the store and buying the books themselves. The librarians are going to provide it, the teachers are going to provide it, the parents or the grandparents are going to provide it. So make sure that it's not something that they wouldn't let their kids read. So if you have kids, you can probably determine what you wouldn't want to let your kids read. So that might be another way to go about it. So I hope that helps. So Marianne Ferrara asks, I outlined a trilogy all at once, and now I'm a third into the first book. The problem is I only just realized the second book has almost no action scenes with fighting, which the first and last book have plenty of. I'm not sure how to add fight scenes that don't seem like they are thrown in at random to add tension and don't add anything to the story. However, I need more fighting and less talk about politics. Okay, so this is a really common problem in trilogies. Pretty much you're going to structure a trilogy like you're going to structure a story, so you're going to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. The saggy middle is a problem even when you just have a standalone story. So when you have a trilogy, it's very common for the second book to sag and to become a lot of political conversations or a lot of discussions and a lot of propelling the novel from the first to the third book, or propelling the series from the first to the third book. So you end up doing a lot of setup and transitioning that isn't necessarily exciting. So you definitely don't want that to be the case. So what I recommend is to look at the second book as a standalone book and think, would I sell this story by itself? Is this plot good enough by itself? If it didn't need the first book or the third book and could stand alone, is the story actually good enough? If it's not, then you need to go back and revise it and give it a more interesting plot. If it is, the fighting probably isn't necessarily a problem as long as it's not the basis of the story. If the story is about this character learning how to fight, and then there's no mention of fighting in the second book, then that's probably going to be a problem. But assuming that fighting is not that big of a component or not that important of a component to the book and it's just sort of a circumstantial component, then I probably wouldn't really worry about that not being a big part of the second book as long as it's interesting. It sounds like you're saying the second book is probably not as interesting as it needs to be, and that's most likely related to the plot rather than to an absence of fight scenes. All right, you guys have had some really good questions. It's really fun for me to get to talk about writing, so I hope that you guys enjoy it because I enjoy it. Okay, so Miguel asks, In my novel, I have scenes where multiple things are going on at the same time in different places that all affect and play off of one another. What is the best way to show everyone's thoughts without head hopping? So presumably in this situation, you're writing in omniscient point of view. Otherwise, I don't think there's any real way that you could do this. If you're writing in third limited or first person and you want to jump around to multiple things going on in one scene, you're probably going to really confuse people, and it's probably not going to be very smooth. So I don't recommend doing that. If you are writing an omniscient, that's probably the best way to go about it. But to be honest, if you have a lot of things going on in one scene, it's pretty hard to pull that off even in omniscient point of view. So I would read a lot of novels written in omniscient to get a better idea of how you might be able to do this. But I'd also think critically about what do you really need to convey, and do all of these different things need to have equal weight? Do they all need to be described? Could some be described in the aftermath of the scene? I don't know. I don't know what your exact circumstances, so it's hard to give specific advice, but I would caution against too much chaos in a single scene and too much going on, because it can be really confusing to the reader to bounce around. The other thing is readers sort of like to settle into a particular headspace, and jumping around all to different situations and different characters and different thoughts and feelings can prevent the reader from relaxing, and it requires a high level of attention that not all readers are interested in giving to a book, especially if they just want to have fun. So you have to consider that, especially regarding what genre your book is. If it's more of a fun genre, I'd just be careful that you don't overwhelm the reader. Okay, so Amy asks, do you think every story has the potential to become something amazing? All right, well, this sort of depends on at what point you think that a story is no longer the same story. Most of the writers that I work with end up rewriting significant amounts of their novel, often, frequently, close to all of their novel. The reason for this is because the first draft just lacked focus. So it's often not so much that the story has no potential, but that the writer took it in a direction that isn't marketable, or a direction that's just too scattered and isn't focused enough. And so it depends at what point you consider a story to not be the same story. There are definitely stories that don't work when you're talking about marketability, and it sort of depends again on how you define amazing. You could write an amazing story that there's just no market for and could not be sold. So, for example, if you write a middle grade book about, say, a murderer, a child who's a murderer, it's very unlikely that that would ever be marketable. You could rewrite the story for adults, and then it might be marketable, but you could argue that it's not the same story at that point. So it sort of depends on how you're defining those terms. But I would say every story definitely does not have potential to succeed. And I know a lot of people will get mad about that, and a lot of people do not want to hear that. But writing is a business. Publishing is a business. They want to publish. The publishers want to publish novels that will make money, and not all novels will make money. Not all ideas behind novels have enough appeal to enough people to make enough money for a publisher to want to sell them. That doesn't necessarily mean that you could not self-publish. It doesn't necessarily mean that your story isn't amazing, but it just means if by amazing you mean that the novel can be sold and enjoyed by a large or a somewhat large audience. It's definitely just not true of every story, unfortunately. Okay, so the next question is from Mean Mr. Mustard, who asked, it is said if you mention a rifle on the mantle to make sure you use that rifle in some manner, otherwise it may end up being unnecessary filler. When is it necessary or appropriate to mention items in a room if they are not connected to the plot but also don't end up as just plain old boring filler? Okay, my advice about this is to only include descriptions that tell the reader something about the character or the circumstance or about another character, something that would be in some way meaningful. So, for example, describing a house as being cracked and the tile or the roof tiles falling off, the shingles falling off, the door is off its hinge. That conveys a lot about the location and about the person who may or may not live there. If somebody interacts with a person who is very meticulously dressed, that says a lot about who they are. So using the descriptions of clothes, of locations, of things in the room to highlight something about a character or a circumstance is great. But if it has nothing to do with anything, I would give the minimum necessary to set the scene, just to give an impression of where the characters are so that the reader can visualize it. And otherwise, I would just leave out any extra details if it really doesn't have to do with anything and it doesn't convey anything to the reader. So the next question is from Florencia, who says that she's wondering about writing a story about the perspective of one or more characters. Could you share some tips on how to construct a character's narration and how to best choose if and when to change perspective? Okay, so choosing when to change perspective when you have multiple perspectives, it can be tricky for some writers to understand how this should work. But if you have multiple perspectives, when you switch, there should be a reason that you switch. It should not be based on something arbitrary like very clear rotations of characters. It's not that this is wrong. You can do this, but you have to basically structure around it if you do that. So if you want to have like a very clean rotation, so it goes from character A to character B to character C to character A to character B to character C, and it just repeats that pattern, you're going to have to plot the novel so that that works. So I don't necessarily recommend doing that because it can be very forced and can be very difficult. So how you choose to change the perspective or the character's point of view, not in a situation where you're trying to do a very specific pattern, is that you need to let the plot dictate it. So it needs to switch at the point where what that character is doing advances the plot and what another character is doing does not advance the plot. So if you're in character A and it gets to a point where character A is not advancing the plot, switch to whatever character is advancing the plot at that point. That's the best way to do it. Writing multiple points of view is a lot more difficult than writing one point of view. And I bring that up only because so many aspiring writers want to write a novel with multiple points of view as their very first novel, and it's just really, really hard to do. So I'm by no means discouraging you from doing it. I'm just saying it's difficult, and hopefully that will help. Those tips will help, but it's difficult, and sometimes it can be easier to learn the basics on a novel with one perspective, but that's sort of irrelevant. I'm just rambling at this point, but you might consider learning about story structure and scene structure. If you don't, I don't know, so maybe you already know, but if you don't know that much about it, I would learn about it in a simpler situation, writing a simpler novel before you write something with multiple points of view, because how you dictate when you change perspectives is entirely based on the structure of the novel and the structure of how you can move the plot forward. Alright, so that is all for now. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I will have part 4 up very soon, so I hope that you will subscribe if you're not subscribed so that you don't miss that. And I really hope that you guys are enjoying these Q&A videos, and I will see you very soon.